It was only a cupcake, its frosting a careless swirl of buttercream, its paper cup torn from the supply bin, a single stubborn candle pressed into the center. The flame trembled as Amara leaned over it, the tiny light turning the kitchen into a private chapel. At that hour, the mansion's heart slowed to the sound of water cooling in pipes, the hum of refrigerators, the distant clock in the hall. She breathed in the lemon-scented sugar and let herself pretend, for a single thin minute, that the room belonged to her. The cake had been stolen in the most ordinary way, a tray left unguarded during the luncheon clearance, a hand quick as habit, a pocket folded around a paper cup. She had counted the seconds before she could bring a flame to the wick, feeling ridiculous and grateful all at once. Years of giving other people's celebrations weight had taught her how to make small, private rituals. Tonight, she would make a wish for herself. She could hear Mrs. Whitfield's shoes before she saw her, that measured, strict cadence across the linoleum, the soft rasp of a voice used to correcting things into a particular order. When the head housekeeper leaned against the doorway, the kitchen's lamplight cut a stern outline across her face. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" she asked, as if the act were a misdemeanor pinned down in the manual. Amara's fingers stilled above the candle. The flame licked soft, steady. For 12 years she had learned to lower her head at the sound of that voice, to make herself small and invisible in the rooms that paid her rent. She set the match down and for a second allowed the flame to be only a point of light between them. She began. She had rehearsed nothing for this. Her daughter, Zara, turned 6 today. There was a wish she kept folded in the back of her mouth. A promise of a little party on the kitchen table when the shift ended, a paper crown made from yesterday's ledger, a makeshift present sewn from spare fabric. It was ridiculous, maybe improper, but none of it was wrong. Mrs. Whitfield's expression didn't soften. "You know the rules. No food off service counters without permission. And for the love of God, Amara, your hands." She reached for a cloth as if to wipe the air clean of the impropriety. It should have been the end of it. A reprimand, a penitent nod, a reprise to the sink and the never-ending wash. Instead, a voice came from the doorway behind them that made both women turn. "Leave her be." The voice belonged to Dominic Cross. He had not been expected. He wore a dark coat with a line of rain on the shoulders and his hair still wet at the collar. Dominic moved through the kitchen like a man stepping into a room he half inherited and half invented. The mansion assumed his presence with the same quiet deference it gave to clocks and chandeliers. Tonight, though, he looked smaller than the house.
Grief had folded itself into the planes of his face, softened his edges in a way that made him more human than any portrait. For a second, Amara froze with the absurd hope that something new might happen. Dominic paused by the table, took in the candle flame, the delicate tilt of Amara's jaw. He did not ask why she had the cupcake. He did not scold. He reached out and took the paper cup into his fingers, the action oddly tender. "Is it your birthday?" he asked, as if noting a weather change. Amara's mouth was dry. "My daughter's," she said. "Zara's 6. He cradled the cupcake, brought the candle closer to his own lips. "Make a wish," he said. The words landed on her small, private flame like a hand laid over a lantern. The impossible part was not that he had stopped Mrs. Whitfield. It was the way his voice refused to make her disappear. She made a wish the way you do when the eyes of every housemaid you have ever been trained to be are watching, quickly, almost as if the wish itself could be punished. Her breath fogged the tiny flame. The candle shrank and bowed, and then steadied again, as if willing itself to burn longer for a child's birthday. Dominic looked at her then, not the look of a man assessing servants, but of someone trying to guess another person's sorrow. He set the cupcake down, and after a pause that tasted like rain, he said, "Come to my study, now." The command folded the kitchen's air into something sharper. Mrs. Whitfield's lips tightened. Amara's hands were already moving to white frosting from her fingers, to corral the small cake back into the paper cup. She had never been summoned alone by her employer. Summons were for reprimands and for tasks that needed muscles. This felt different, precarious, and full of possibility. She glanced at Mrs. Whitfield and then at Dominic's closed, quiet expression. The study smelled faintly of old paper and lemon oil. A single desk lamp threw a circle of light across a desk where a silver locket lay half open, its photos dulled by time. He left the door ajar. The leather chair behind it was warm, as if someone had just risen, though the room had been empty a moment ago. "Sit," he said. He set the cupcake on the desk between them, as if it were a treaty. Amara perched on the edge of a chair and watched him watch the candle burn. He did not ask for an explanation. Instead, he told her that Isabella had loved chocolate. He said the name as if it were an offering and a wound at once. Isabella, his niece, small and gone, had been a bright thing inside that house once. He spoke in fragments, not to draw sympathy, but because the words were small enough to hold. "I never expected anyone to hide a cake under the counter," he added, wry and oddly soft. His thumb brushed the locket. But then I never expected to find people who keep their joy secret. The way he said joy made something inside Amara unhook.
She had been taught to keep joy folded, as one tucks a child's drawing into the back of a drawer. It was safer that way. To be noticed for something as ridiculous as wanting a cupcake could mean trouble. But Dominic's silhouette in the lamplight was not the kind that punished curiosity. He straightened, and, with a small decisiveness that surprised her, he blew on the candle until the flame dipped, and then relit it from his own lighter. "Make another wish," he said. His face had a patience that did not demand gratitude. It demanded nothing, and still gave her space to be seen. When she did make the second wish, it was not for money, nor for better housing, but for something quieter. For Zara to sleep through storms without nightmares, for the small dignity of time to breathe. When the wick guttered and the flame shrank, Dominic closed his hand around the paper cup as if to protect it. "You're not to be punished for this," he said abruptly. "But I would like you to cook for me tomorrow evening. A private dinner. You will choose the menu." He didn't frame it as charity. He framed it as an experiment. "Show me what you do," he said. Amara felt the floor tilt. The offer was electrical with possibility and danger. A private dinner with the owner, an invitation, was a rare, sharp thing. It could be a way out, or a way deeper into scrutiny. For all the years she had kept her head down, a part of her had hungered to be judged on skill rather than station. Still, there was a ledger of risks in her mind, eyes that measured, gossip that hardened into policy, a house that knew how to use kindness like cartilage to control. "Why me?" she asked. Her voice was more honest than she intended. It was the question that had lodged like grit in her throat for a decade. Why single her out? Dominic's jaw tightened. "Because you reminded me there are small things left to protect," he said. "And because I want someone I can trust to be exact. If I'm going to invite truth into this house, I want the person who understands its edges." She left the study with a list of impossible ingredients and a certainty that the cake had done something beside marking a birthday. On the walk back to the staff quarters, the candle smoke trailed in her mind like an omen of things to come. Mrs. Whitfield watched her re-enter the kitchen with an expression that was hard to read, part calculation, part threat. The next day the kitchen hummed differently. Preparations began at dawn, the staff moving with a choreography that always made Amara think of church rituals. She washed the spinach so the leaves shone like small green coins. She measured salt and sugar with a steadiness that kept her hands from thinking about the look on Dominic's face the night before. Zara's small paper crowns, one per plate, were smuggled into a tote as if contraband. Some of the other women watched her with an interest that was not entirely celebratory. Natalie, who had been here less than a year, smiled the smile of someone eager for a story that might move her own needle from survival to possibility. Rosa, who had come from the city a decade before, kept her distance, as if the house's air could still blindside people who were too curious. Mrs. Whitfield hovered like a storm cloud. She offered assistance that was always a critique in disguise. "Small plates," she suggested when Amara proposed an appetizer, in a tone that implied Amara's taste needed refinement. "We don't waste the master's appetite on frivolity." Amara said nothing. She had learned the art of letting certain comments fall away like water off wax. But the comment landed, and it made something in her tighten. The kitchen, she realized, was not simply where food was prepared, it was also a stage where positions were claimed and maintained. Dominic's instructions were exacting and oddly intimate. "No frills," he said, "just honest food. And don't use the lemon chiffon in the third pantry. That's for the guests at the foundation luncheon." He paused. "And no one else in the study tonight. This is for me." She could see why he wanted honesty. The house had layers of etiquette that often disguised the rot beneath. To him, maybe, a plate of food was the kind of truth that could be read without translation. To her, it was a test of whether someone with resources could be trusted to value skill without claiming ownership of the person behind it. When she arrived with the hot trays, Julian, the head of security, led her through the inner doors with a quick nod that felt less like permission and more like recognition. He had known her. In the way men who protect watch the details others miss, the way her jaw clenched when the tempo in the house rose, the way she moved with a rhythm learned in other kitchens and other demands. The private dinner was small, just Dominic and a woman he'd invited some weeks earlier, an advisor who dealt with the foundation's programming. It was a litmus test, Dominic had said.
He wanted to see how a plate could shift a conversation, how a flavor could carry truth. He watched her more than he ate, but he ate with enough pleasure to make Amara feel seen, and seeing is a strange economy. Afterwards, before she left the study, he handed her a folded note. It was a slip of his stationery with 2 lines and a rough star of ink. "Thank you," it said in his tight hand. "Come by my office whenever you need anything." Amara folded the note into her pocket like a map. Back in the staff wing, the news traveled like a scent on the wind. That evening rooms hummed with the retelling of the private dinner. Some spoke respectfully of the plate she had set down, others with a keen, dangerous hunger. Whispered commentary when she passed felt like knives that had been polished to look like compliments. Mrs. Whitfield's whispers were the worst. They cut into the kitchen's air and left it chill.
She spoke in the currency of rules. "We are the keepers of this house, Amara. There's a way of doing things." Her glance at the paper crown peeking from Amara's tote was cold enough to prune the edges of joy. Amara's life outside the house was a different kind of geography. The small apartment she rented with Zara had a bicycle bell that hung on a nail, a line of mismatched plates on a shelf. Zara's drawings were tacked to the wall with thumbtacks that Amara couldn't always afford to replace. At night, they read stories under a single lamp, and in the morning, Zara's small hands packed a school bag with lunches Amara made from last night's leftovers. Zara believed their life was an adventure with hideouts and treasures. Amara knew it was built of hard choices, of refusal and compromise. Amara's memory of organizing meetings, of standing in a room with other laborers and handing out leaflets, returned unbidden while she stirred sauces and folded napkins. She had been younger then, quick with arguments and fearlessness. That work had charged her with a language of rights and public voice. It had also taught her the cost of standing up. There had been nights when the police lights had painted the sky, when names were called over bullhorns, and when they had taken one of their own for asking too loudly for fairness. She had left that life by degrees: marriage, a baby, the need for steadier income. She had not expected that the hunger for justice would ever thread itself back into a place like this. The day after the private dinner, notes began to appear. Not the kind with inked thank yous, but the fragile slips that suggested surveillance. A bent paperclip in her locker, a smudge of grease on the handle of the door she used, a folded scrap that read, in a handwriting she recognized as Mrs. Whitfield's, "Remember your place." Those notes were small acts of violence because they were designed to make her doubt her right to stand straight. She felt them as a tightening of the chest, an old reflex to shrink. They did not make her cower. They made Amara thoughtful, collecting observation like evidence. She was not the same woman who would have folded under the weight of intimidation. That life of organizing had taught her to see patterns, to look for the seams where things were stitched together. Julian found her one morning in the archive room, a place few staff entered. He had keys that opened doors others would not imagine approaching. For the first time, he did not stand like a guard, but like a human watching for danger. "You'll get yourself noticed," he said, though his voice carried more warning than rebuke. "If you're poking through files that aren't yours, you'll be given a role you didn't ask for." She met his gaze. "It's not poking," she said. "Everything here has a paper trail." He glanced at her hands, calloused and deft, and then at the small stack of ledgers on the table. "What are you looking for?" She smiled briefly. "Clarity." "If someone's trying to make this house look like it always was, I want to see the receipts." Dominic's attention turned the house on its axis. Where once people had slid into shadows, their roles relegated to service, they now found themselves under the soft, intrusive light of being noticed. Some felt honored, others felt exposed. The old guard, Mrs. Whitfield chief among them, began to move as if defending a perimeter that had always been hers to guard. She counted the staff's faces like someone counting her flock, sorting those she trusted from those she'd allowed to rise. Rumors collected like dust on the staircases. Voices speculated about Dominic's intentions. Some said he was trying to mollify his conscience after the niece's death. Others whispered that he was indulging a whim, or that he had a charitable streak that required a moral audience. Amara paid them no mind. Rumors were the inadequate currency of truth. She preferred documents. There was a painting in the main hall, an ancestral portrait, its painted faces fixed in the posture of solemnity, that Mrs. Whitfield polished each morning until its varnish gleamed like a layer of false skin. The painting had always felt like a talisman of order. One morning when Amara went by the hall to deliver linens, she noticed the frame had a light scrawl across its corner. faint but deliberate, like a child's hand, but older in intent. It was defaced with a smear of dark paint that read like a question more than an accusation, as if someone had tested the surface to see whether it would flake away. Mrs. Whitfield's face when she saw it was an exhibition of control threatened. She carried the smear as a personal affront. "This house has standards," she told anyone who would listen, her voice calibrating like an instrument on the verge of a storm. "Someone wants to unsettle them." That evening the staff quarters ringed with a sterile vigilance, doors closed with more care, people spoke in clipped sentences. Amara felt the smear on the painting as an externalization of an internal pressure. The house was riven by fear of what being seen could produce. The anomaly of her cupcake had shifted something nobody else could name. Amara found a folded note in her apron pocket, unmarked, with 3 simple words. "Be careful, Amara." No signature, no accusation, just a tremor of concern. It could have been from Julian. It could have been from Rosa. It could have been from someone who watched and chose to keep their own silence. Whoever it was, the note landed like a pebble in a pond and sent ripples across the surface of what she thought she understood. That night she sat on the small stoop outside their apartment and watched Zara sleep through the window, a shadow under a nightlight, her face slack with child peace. Amara curled the note between her fingers until the paper softened with touch. She had a habit of folding small things into patterns when the world refused to behave.
She thought of the candle's flame and the delicious, absurd fact that a tiny light could alter the course of a room's mood. She thought of the way Dominic had asked her to cook, and how delicate the boundary between being seen and being put on display could be. There were many practicalities that kept her tethered. The rent on the apartment had a deadline that waited like a clock. Zara needed new shoes for school. There were errands that multiplied like rabbits, and a rhythm that steadied them both. Being noticed by a man with money should have simplified things. Instead, it complicated them. Visibility meant vulnerability in a house where being visible had historically been the first step toward being used. Even so, she could not shake the small, bright knowledge that refusing to be invisible anymore had a cost, but it also had a gravitational pull. The choice to step forward had always been the one she had feared and desired equally. She began to prepare with a quiet intensity for the next time she would be asked into Dominic's world. Not just recipes, but contingencies. She cataloged the names of people who moved like currents in the house. She checked which doors locked from the inside and which had surveillance. She noted Julian's patrol times and the times Mrs. Whitfield spent inspecting silverware. Each detail was a thread she would weave into a safety net. When she returned to the mansion, the air felt charged. Julian's nod was brief. His eyes carried an extra edge that said he had seen more than he named. Dominic's study now held not just a locket, but a small, almost imperceptible stack of letters he rifled through like someone who never unlearned the economy of people and papers. He was not oblivious to the shifting currents. Grief had taught him the sound of precariousness. "You are preparing a menu for more than one person now," he said once, after a dinner where he had tasted the 3rd course and paused, savoring it like a man testing whether cedar smoke could be conquered by citrus. "I cook for what I know," Amara replied. Her voice was steady. She wanted to be clear that she would not be reduced to spectacle. He set the empty plate down and met her eyes. "Good," he said. "Then show me." Their conversations grew from culinary instruction into something with a quieter gravity. He told her about Isabella and Vignette, about how the girl had traced the pattern on the family rug, and how she had loved to stand on roof tiles and feel like she was close to the sky. He did not expect her to repair his grief. He offered it like a fact, the way you might offer a photograph to someone who had never seen it. Amara listened, and, where she felt it appropriate, offered small facts from her life, how Zara liked her blueberries mashed into plain yogurt, how she had once stood on a picket line in the city and felt the exhilarating, dangerous solidarity of people leaning against an injustice. Between them there was a cautious diplomacy forming, where grief touched resilience but did not consume it. Dominic did not flatter. Amara did not acquiesce. The lines were clear enough to hold fidelity. In the margins of their conversations, a mutual respect printed itself like a watermark. It was a precarious formation, like frost on a window that looked fragile but could hold. But the house did not like change. The old guard clustered in ways that made the walls feel like a single organism resisting a new infection. Mrs. Whitfield began to insist on paperwork for tasks that had never required it. Schedules shifted. Staff gatherings were scheduled with a tone that suggested observation rather than community. People who had once shared sly jokes with Amara avoided the corners of their eyes when she approached them. Amara's presence at Dominic's table was a quiet revolution in the household hierarchy. When she delivered a dish, hands that had once snubbed her met the plate with an almost reflexive respect. Some of that respect was practical,
Her food was good, and skill is a currency in any house, while some of it was a tentative revaluation. People wondered what it meant when someone like Dominic gave endorsements that did not come tied to power abuses. The private dinner invitation quietly granted her access. It also exposed her to scrutiny that felt invasive. Amara discovered she had to recalibrate how she navigated spaces where people assumed many things. She found herself thinking in longer arcs, wondering if a misstep could be used to define her. She thought of the note she had folded away and of the smear on the painting. The next morning, a new sheet of paper lay on the kitchen counter, an invitation on the foundation's stationery. Dominic had arranged for her to attend a small staff briefing where the foundation's director would meet the domestic team informally. It was a modest thing on paper. In practice, it meant she would be seen by people who made decisions about programs and grants. Mrs. Whitfield did not like the idea. "This house requires limits," she told Amara in the pantry, whispering as if the wood itself had ears. "It's one thing to be a good cook. It's another to be in a room with those who decide what this place does." Amara's reply was measured. "I don't want to sit for any theatrics," she said. "I want to understand how work is decided. People in town ask for things. If we are to serve them, someone should know how those decisions are made." Mrs. Whitfield's fingers tightened into a fist around a jar of clothes. "Stick to your station," she said. "Stations are not for negotiation." The word station sounded like a lock slammed shut. But Amara had never been content to be locked into any one place. She had decided what she would teach Zara about courage, that it did not always roar. Sometimes it breathed, collected evidence, and waited.
A quiet confrontation unfurled in the kitchen a week later when the painting smear took on a new intensity. The portrait's frame was shifted, as if someone had tried to remove it, and the varnish bore a fresh coating of darkened fingerprint swirls. Mrs. Whitfield summoned the staff in a way that resembled a small inquisition. She charged Amara with negligently leaving doors open, insinuated that her child's friends had been seen near the service entrance. The accusations were paper-thin and heavy-handed. Amara spoke up. "If someone wanted to test the house, they would have used an outsider," she said. Her tone was quiet, controlled. "We should look at surveillance, check logs. A smear like that can't be a guess." Mrs. Whitfield's response was the kind of simmering anger that was dangerous, because it sounded sanctimonious. "You're very kind to suggest cameras," she said, "but perhaps we are not in need of your detective skills." The room's air changed. Heads turned, whispers rolled. A small, unpleasant laugh drifted from a corner. Amara felt the attack not as a personal strike, but as the steady application of tactics meant to retake ground. If someone in the house wanted her gone, there were mechanisms for that. Filed complaints, invented incidents, whispers carried to the boardroom. She knew those instruments. She had seen them used in the picket lines, where rumor could be a weapon as lethal as any law. That night, before turning in, she opened the little tin where she kept the note from Dominic, and the scrap with the words, "Be careful, Amara." She smoothed the paper and felt it thinning under her fingers. The sunroom light through their window made a pool against the floor that looked like another candle flame. In that light she understood two things: that being seen had opened doors she had not expected to be opened, and that with visibility came attack. She began to make simple, practical lists: the times when Julian's patrol shifted, the location of the house's older cameras, which files in the archive were accessible, where ledgers were stored, who had access to them. These were small, non-heroic acts. She did not want to be a heroine theatrically. She wanted to be a person who could answer in ways that preserved her dignity and that of the people she loved. When she returned to the estate in the morning, a folded envelope sat at her locker. It was official-looking, with a crest she recognized from the foundation's stationery, but no sender. She opened it with the caution of someone who knew envelopes could be promises or traps. Inside was a single line: "Your skill has been noticed. Keep your place." The line was signed without a name. Amara's stomach folded with a strange mixture of anger and amusement. Who in the house thought power was a toy to be waved at someone else? Who imagined they could define her worth with a sentence? She tucked the envelope into her apron with the others and went to work.
Her hands performed their rites: the steady scrape of vegetables, the press of pastry, a flick of sauce. In the measured rhythm of her labor, she found a foothold. Skills were tangible. They could be seen and counted and verified. Where whispers could cleave a person, evidence could anchor them. That afternoon, Julian stopped her as she passed with a tray. His hand hovered at her elbow and then rested there for a second, a human, unspoken sentinel. "Careful who you trust," he said simply, and left. Amara understood that this house had more than one way of speaking. There were voices that offered invitations and those that planted traps. There were people who could open doors and those who would put them under lock. A private dinner had shifted the balance and thrown everything into relief. Now she had to decide how she would answer. She walked through the quiet halls where the portraits watched with impassive faces. She paused at the painting with the smear and ran her fingers along the frame, feeling the varnish's bump where the paint had dried. She thought of the candle's smoke and how a small flame could make even a mansion notice. If a child's birthday cake had started this, then the consequence of being noticed was heavy as a stone and sharp as glass. As the evening's light turned blue and the house settled into its rituals, a small, almost imperceptible knock sounded at her door. It was Mrs. Whitfield. She carried a tray with a single dish on it, a neat portion of stew, garnished and fragrant. "I thought you might want to eat before you take on more," Mrs. Whitfield said. The words were simple. The gesture was something else entirely. Perhaps a test, perhaps an olive branch. Amara accepted the tray. The stew was good. The exchange was neutral, but behind it was a pressure like two tectonic plates that could either rub and spark or slide back into a brittle piece. Amara set the tray down at her small table and looked at the candle stub in her apron pocket. She could have chosen, at that moment, to slip back into the life of quiet labor. She could have let the smear on the painting be, and the notes and the whispers dissolve into the usual surgical economy of house politics. Instead, she folded the stub into a clean square of cloth and tucked it away with a deliberate hand. Tomorrow, she planned, she would come in early and review the schedules. She would talk to Julian about camera logs. She would find the ledger entries that matched the foundation's minutes. She would not be passive. Outside, someone across the lane lit a fire, and the scent of wood smoke drifted into the night. Zara slept, untroubled, dreaming perhaps of paper crowns and secret cakes. Amara listened to her child's even breaths and allowed herself for one small moment to feel an ember of hope. This house could be a place of work or a place of healing. It could be a place of silence or one of testimony. She did not yet know how the currents would run.
She only knew that the candle had been lit, and that once a flame existed in the world, it demanded attention. Before she closed the window, she pressed her palms to the glass. Her hands were the instruments she knew best, capable, steady, lit with 1,000 quiet acts. The light of the oil lamp in the hall smeared across the lawn like a soft, tentative promise. In the morning, when she walked into the kitchen, the staff's conversations had a keyed excitement to them. Papers rustled where previously they had been still. A young woman dropped a tray and then laughed in a way that felt like relieved energy. Mrs. Whitfield's expression was a mask refined into a blade. And on the bulletin board, pinned under the foundation's crest, was a small announcement. A casual meeting with staff to be held in the Manor parlor that evening. An opportunity for domestic staff to meet the foundation's program director and speak of community needs. Amara read the notice twice. It was an opportunity and a risk. Attending could mean being asked silly questions about the quality of the pies served at fundraisers. It could mean being acknowledged. It could also mean being thrown into the middle of a room where people spoke in languages built of grant cycles and petty condescensions. She folded the note from the board into her pocket and tied her apron. Zara would need new pencils and a fresh lunch. Dominic had a private dinner to which she had been invited next week. The smear on the painting would be cleaned, and someone would claim moral outrage. Someone else would be rewarded for that outrage. She moved through the house with the quiet of someone who had long been practiced at being small, but who had begun, in the light of a single candle and a private invitation, to feel something else rising. A capacity to be seen without surrendering agency. Whatever lay ahead, she knew that being visible changed the claims people made upon you. It could open doors to dignity or to surveillance. It was, in the end, also a choice. That evening she found Julian in the corridor and asked him plainly for the camera logs. He hesitated only as long as a man considering whether to betray a code of silence, then said, "I'll bring them to you after hours."
She nodded. Her voice was steady. "Bring them somewhere safe," she said. "I don't want anyone watching." He met her eyes, and there was a small, frank understanding between them. "No one's watching," he said, "but someone's keeping records." And for the first time since the candle had burned low on that stolen cupcake, Amara felt like the rooms she cleaned and the food she made could be the instruments of a different kind of reckoning. The house, which had expected her to stay invisible, had issued an invitation. She would answer on her terms. The cake had been a beginning.
The wish had been modest and quiet, and now it had set in motion a sequence that would test loyalties, reveal old rot, and demand that she decide how loudly she would be heard. If you've ever been seen when you expected to remain invisible, tell us where you're watching from. It matters, more than you might know. The meeting that evening had the feel of a small theater gathering. The Foundation's director was young and careful with his words. He spoke about outreach programs and the challenges of connecting resources to communities, the way a gardener speaks about trout. Dominic sat to the side with his hands folded, his expression listening. Amara listened too, but her attention kept catching on the people in the room. Not the donors or the administrators, but the faces of a few local activists who watched these discussions as if you could tell truth from a mouth. A woman with a scar on her knuckle spoke of a community center that had been promised funding for years. Her voice was steady, uncompromising. When the director asked for practical proposals, Amara stood almost without intending to. She had not planned to speak, but the words came like bread breaking. Simple requests for clarity on how grants were allocated, for community input to be considered before lists were made. When she finished, the room was quiet for a beat, so weighty that she felt the hum of an audience after an act. Dominic leaned forward and said plainly, "That's useful. I'd like to have her on an advisory group." Silence slid into the room and gathered like a net. Some faces brightened. Others, like Mrs. Whitfield's, set like a mask of displeasure. The director, polite and careful, nodded and made a note. The paper rustle sounded like a decision. Amara felt a wash of adrenaline. The offer implied authority and visibility. It also suggested new responsibilities and new eyes measuring her. When she accepted, the room exhaled and then rearranged itself. The director's polite nod translated into paper and protocol the next morning. A formal invitation, a thin line of official ink that turned a tentative promise into something harder to ignore. Staff who had only ever moved between kitchens and linen closets began to look at one another with the unsteady curiosity of people watching a slow sunrise. For Amara, the acceptance was both a hinge and a step. It meant sitting at a table where decisions were made, but it also meant sitting under new scrutiny. Word traveled the way it always did in the house, softly, by the clatter of a tray, in the syllables that pass across the prep table. Natalie was the first to smile at her with a real, unhurried smile. Rosa came by the pantry with a bag of cilantro and whispered, "Good for you." But Mrs. Whitfield's face registered like weather, a low, gathering pressure. She watched Amara with eyes that catalogued grievances like receipts, saving them for a day they might yield leverage. Alan Hargrove heard the news before the staff bulletin did. He heard it in the quiet of the boardroom phone calls, in the way Dominic's name traveled with a new inflection, one of curiosity turned to investment. Alan had always thought in margins and percentages. He kept mental accounts of reputations as though they were ledger lines. A housekeeper on the Foundation's informal advisory list offset projected revenues, he told himself, and where there is offset, there can be remedy. He began with small measures, a quiet email, the kind that landed in inboxes and suggested that certain personnel moves were considerations for stability. An op-ed planted in a local paper, worrying about the blur of philanthropic theater and domestic dignity. A whisper in the ears of donors that the Foundation's image should remain above internal experiments. These were not crimes, not yet. They were the softest part of a blade. They aimed first to unsettle. Mrs. Whitfield's tactics were sharper. She began to circulate lists of procedural infractions with a fervor that made them look like devotional statements. She insisted on logbooks rewritten with surgical specificity. Where before a tray might have gone without a signature, now a line was demanded and archived. She pulled up the house's old complaints, small grievances that could be repurposed into patterns, and set them on a table like a seamstress laying out fabrics. Against these fabrics, she could fit the shape of any argument. Amara kept working. She taught herself to move with a new kind of attention. The movements she had practiced for years,
folding napkins, trimming lemon zest, steadying a tray, now doubled as measures of steadiness for her own nerve. Julian, who had watched her since his first months on the estate, started giving her pieces of information that were careful and coded. He handed her camera logs at odd hours, the files slipped into an envelope with no signature, and he kept an eye on patrols that shifted like the currents of a tide. One afternoon, a note arrived that did not feel like paper but like a hand laid on her neck, an official letter from the county social services requesting an immediate meeting concerning the welfare of Zara. It was couched in language meant to seem routine. Concern for child safety, report received. But the timing was a blade. It came 3 days after Amara's acceptance at the advisory table, and in the envelope lay the implicit threat that visibility now invited institutional interference. Amara's first thought was that someone had filed a complaint. Her second, sharper, instinctive thought was that the complaint was manufactured. She had seen enough of how complaint processes could be weaponized in the union meetings she once attended. She called Julian with hands that refused to tremble. "They want to see you at the county office," she told him. "Now." He answered with a single phrase, "Don't go alone."
They arranged differently than the letter expected. Rather than walking into the interview by herself, Amara brought 2 witnesses, Rosa, whose steady hands had steadied many a pan, and a community liaison from a local center who happened, by appointment or by luck, to be in town that morning. Julian parked his sedan across the street and waited with the engine off, a dark shadow that felt like a shield. At the county office, the questions were clinical and the tone officious. The caseworker read from a script, noting that it was in the child's interest to have an adult available to speak on the matter. Amara answered with quiet clarity, where she lived, the hours she worked, the steps she had taken to register Zara at school. The liaison spoke of a stable home and of Amara's reputation in the community. Rosa gave a simple, earnest testimony about Zara's before and after school routine. The caseworker's face held an expression Amara knew from many lines of dispute, an attempt at neutrality that's never neutral. Papers rustled. The meeting ended with an outcome that left no immediate removal. The case would remain open while a routine home visit was scheduled. It was bureaucratic sugar meant to soften the fright. It still felt like a pressure on the throat. As they left the office, Amara saw Alan in the distance, his coat a dark shape in the crowd. He didn't look guilty. He looked instead like a man who kept his hands in pockets and let systems do his clumsy work. Amara felt a cold certainty that sensed the pattern. The letter, the timing, the anonymous report. Something stitched to look official, but pulled by a hand that had better accounts than it admitted. She returned to the house with the letter folded like a map, and a plan forming like a knot she would unravel. She had not come this far to have her child used as a pawn. She moved with the quiet patience of the investigator she had been inside herself for months, careful, cataloging, always seeking corroboration. The first piece of confirmation came in the archives. Julian, keeping to his promise, had left a flash drive in the library's return box with a sticky note that said only, "For Amara." She sat with it, fingers that had trimmed every pastry in the house hovering over the USB like a scalpel. The files contained courier receipts, scanned minutes from the Foundation's smaller committees, and a set of emails that mentioned cleanup and messaging in ways that read like someone describing a PR job, until one email used language far cruder. In that note, a liaison for one of Alan's favorite projects wrote to him about making a scene disappear and proposed funds to cover discomforts. The funds, when traced, used an innocuous program title, West Hill Outreach, but the ledger entries suggested money routed not to community centers, but to shell accounts tied to vendors with names that matched companies Alan had recently acquired. Amara felt the air leave the room.
There it was, a money trail that did not look like charity. It looked like a siphon. They kept digging. Over the next week, she and Julian spent stolen hours in the dim archive rooms, eyes on faded inks and digital logs. Natalie, who had an old affinity for numbers from a job she held in her youth, joined them and proved better at spotting discrepancies than any of them expected. She spotted pattern anomalies in the ledgers, duplicate invoices paid to different addresses, receipts that matched dates of reported repairs, but for properties that were never serviced. One ledger page, folded and forgotten, listed a garden renovation that matched a transfer for nearly $50,000. When cross-referenced with the Foundation's GPS logs, pulled from devices kept on vehicles used by contractors, those vehicles had spent a suspicious number of miles near a private property owned by Alan's firm. The more they found, the more the pieces fit like shards into a map. They discovered that several donors' contributions had been labeled for community work, but were redirected to companies with faint connections to board members. Names they expected to see, organizations and neighborhoods, were replaced with shell entities. There were invoices with handwritten initials that matched a signature practice Julian had seen on other official documents. These were not accidents. They were a system. A breakthrough arrived in the least elegant of ways, a hidden recorder. Amara had the habit, born of years where voices disappeared, of carrying a small pocket-sized recorder when she entered fraught rooms. She'd never intended to use it as evidence, only as a memory aid, but that device held a conversation between Mrs. Whitfield and a man whose voice matched Alan's. The recorder had been left in an old sewing box in the staff wing by accident. When Amara played the file, the voices were unmistakable in their cruelty and calculation. "We put her in the middle," Alan said, in the rough, precise cadence of a man used to commanding edges. A complaint, some social services, a near incident. People are sympathetic to a child. It will complicate matters for her. Mrs. Whitfield's voice cut a ribbon of frost into the air. "Do what is necessary. We keep the house. We keep the reputation. She thinks she can be a part of their circles. Make sure she has reasons to step back." It was worse than they had feared, not merely gossip or marginalization, but a conscious plan to weaponize the structures meant to protect. The recording ended with a clink of glass and a laugh like a blade. Amara listened with the recorder pressed to her palm until her fingers went numb. She had expected malice. She had not expected them to be so explicit. She kept the file close, and then, deliberately, she built the rest of the case. Evidence required more than a whisper.
It needed corroboration and context. The audio, matched to transactions, matched to GPS logs and surveillance footage, would form an iron chain. Julian used his clearance to pull camera footage from a night when a security concern had been reported at the back entrance. The footage showed, to his trained eye, two figures speaking within the camera's blind spot near the delivery bay. One figure matched Mrs. Whitfield's silhouette. The other was heavier in build and walked with a posture Amara recognized from corporate security footage, Alan's shadow. The exchange looked like the one described on the recording, furtive, purposeful. They collected bank statements through public filings and subpoenas Julian assembled with a lawyer Dominic agreed to appoint discreetly. Dominic, on his own, began to press for transparency. He met privately with counsel and for the first time publicly allowed an internal audit to proceed. He gave Amara access to documents he had not previously let anyone near, contracts with vendors, board minutes, purchase orders. He did not tell her how to use them. He told her she could. This was the point when threat and rage hardened. Someone broke a window in the staff wing and left arranged anonymous threats on the table in the form of a child's drawing defaced with ink. A late-night attempt was made to take pictures of Zara at school while Amara walked away from the playground. An unmarked car idled near her apartment for a week until a neighbor asked questions and the car moved on. Each incident was calibrated to ratchet fear, visible enough to cause panic, invisible enough to be plausible deniability. Then came the car. It was an afternoon with the sky heavy enough to push color out of the street. Amara had just collected Zara from after-school art class. The child carried a paper lamppost she had cut from a cereal box, her cheeks flushed with glue. They walked toward the dog park where Amara left the pram, simple, familiar steps. Someone had moved a utility van to block the lane. 3 men approached, their faces set in modes of authority, uniforms simulated for a moment as they demanded she come with them for questioning. One man grabbed her arm with a careful force meant to look procedural. Amara's world narrowed to the weight of a hand on her forearm and the paper lamppost under Zara's arm. She had rehearsed in her head for months many ways to answer, not to scream until it was useful, not to run until she had a path. Her years in organizing had taught her how to turn a moment's panic into strategic motion. She let her body stay steady, and then, as the man gestured toward a van, she went small and quick. She knocked a can of recyclables to the ground in a clatter that sent a flock of pigeons up in a gray wave, and in that second she slipped her hand out, scooped Zara close, and ran. The men chased, and a single honk split the afternoon like a judge's gavel.
Julian, who kept an extra set of patrols and watched more than he admitted, had seen the suspicious van, and his timing had been the only margin between capture and flight. He came out of the lane with his car at speed and drove a short wedge between Amara and the men, lights flashing, though no alarm sounded. The van tried to turn. In the confusion, it clipped the curb and mounted a low brick, its front end denting as if slammed into the house's reputation. No one was hurt beyond the jolt. The men scattered into the afternoon the way guilty things do when lights are turned on them. Amara pressed Zara to her chest in the back seat of Julian's car and felt the shock loosen into fierce heat. She wanted, for a breath, to call Dominic and shout and cry, but she also knew the moment demanded coolness. They drove to a safe house Julian kept under the foundations of the estate, a small guest cottage with ground-floor windows and a kettle that had whispered to more than one overheated night. After the car, the pattern became more urgent. Social services called again, but this time with the county officer more hesitant, listening to the background noises. Amara provided the contact for the liaison who had been with her at the first meeting, and the call paused the process as properly as a hand could. The Foundation's counsel pressed for a formal complaint to be filed against the men who had attempted the abduction. Their identities were murky, but the van's registration led to a shell company connected to a security contractor Allen used for on-site events. The chain again took shape. They were ready then to escalate formally. Dominic convened a private legal team and a select group of board members who he knew would not stonewall transparency. He insisted the audit continue and that any evidence of misconduct be brought before the full board. He also did something that mattered more than money or titles. He stood with Amara in public ways that gave her breath. He wrote a letter to the county attorney urging the matter be investigated thoroughly. He authorized the release of certain security footage to the police. He did not try to shield her from the scrutiny she had asked for. He amplified her ability to request oversight. Amara did not take all of this for granted. She had, in the months of investigation, marshaled her own case. She called community witnesses who could attest to her character and capability. She prepared a folder of documents, the recorder file, copies of dubious invoices, GPS logs, the ledger anomalies, printed and tapped like the work of a person who had been learning to translate suspicion into evidence. She practiced telling the story succinctly so the facts could hold their weight without being drowned by rhetoric. The board hearing convened on a wet morning. The main dining room, usually a place of hush and silver, had been reconfigured like a courtroom. A long table, microphones, a public gallery for press.
Allen arrived with the polished calm of a man used to controlling optics. Mrs. Whitfield's mouth was a thin line. She kept to the shadows as if proximity to clocks could keep time from moving. Dominic sat near the head of the table, his hands folded like someone who had learned how to hold grief with both palms. Amara walked in with the weight of evidence in a folder and the steadiness of someone who had done the work. When she spoke, she did not plead. She laid out the chain, the audio clip, the ledger entries, the GPS logs showing contractor vehicles at private properties correlated with transfers, the security footage of clandestine meetings near the delivery bay. She read the transcripts of emails, the same ones that had seemed like inert phrases until placed with others. She told them plainly about the attempted removal of Zara and about the van. The room listened. There were faces that softened and faces that tightened. Allen tried to speak, phrases of denial and character attacks. The Dominic called for the evidence to be heard in full. The audio played, and in it, Mrs. Whitfield's voice came like a betrayal. The manager of donor relations had to admit certain transfers were routed in ways that lacked oversight. Documents bearing Allen's initials could not be easily explained away. The handwriting matched other signed authorizations. Votes were called. The board, which had once resembled a stone wall of entrenched interests, began to shift. Money trails are hard to spin when matched against recorded admissions. Allen, whose rise had been a series of small, incremental consolidations of opportunities, saw donors recoil. In the end, the vote was decisive. Allen was asked to step down. His roles would be vacated pending further criminal inquiry into financial misdirection. Mrs. Whitfield was suspended, her access revoked pending a full investigation. The resolution was procedural, no glory, no fanfare. But for Amara, it felt like someone had opened a new door and left the light on. She had come to the table not to exult, but to ensure the mechanism of justice functioned. She had wanted, more than punishment, to see the system behave as it should. Evidence gathered, process followed, accountability applied. The fallout rippled outward. Newspapers that had taken Allen's press releases with a bland acceptance now printed the ledger anomalies in black type and the audio transcriptions in columns edged with commentary. Donors asked questions. The Foundation announced an immediate restructuring, tighter audits, transparent vendor selection, a community advisory with rotating membership that included local activists and residents. Dominic, in a statement that was careful and raw, apologized for oversight and committed the Foundation to reparative grants for programs previously promised but never funded. The board's public statements were a mixture of precise language and a kind of contrition.
Amara asked for one thing in the first public meeting called to address the matter: that the Foundation develop an independent oversight committee for grant distribution, one that included people from the neighborhoods affected and that paid staff a fair wage with clear grievance procedures. She did not ask for vengeance. She wanted systems that would prevent the same siphon from happening again. When they announced the press event at the estate to outline the changes, the room smelled of lemon tart and camera lights. Amara stood at the edge of the crowd, Zara by her side, a paper lamppost once more in small hands. Reporters asked questions in a rhythm that made truth feel like a coin pressed into palm. Dominic introduced her as someone whose courage had forced the foundation to do what it should have done without being asked, to look at itself. At the press podium, she spoke. Her voice did not crack. She told the reporters about the importance of visibility and dignity, about how systems speak differently to those who know how to read them, and how citizens and workers have the right to ask questions and expect answers. She thanked those who had supported her, and then spoke directly to the people who felt invisible. "You don't have to be loud to be heard," she said. "You have to be precise. You have to show up with proof and with people who will stand beside you. Names matter, records matter, and here, today, we have asked an institution to answer for itself." Her words landed like a stone thrown into a dark pond. Ripples formed far beyond the room. The foundation pledged a grant to the community center that had been promised years ago, and they helped finance a small nursery for staff children, a concrete measure that made life easier for workers who once feared leaving children unattended while they labored. In private, Dominic did what he had to do to repair trust. He arranged legal assurances for Amara, formalized her position on the advisory committee, and had counsel draft a notarized appointment that gave her authority in grant allocation decisions. He did these things publicly, not behind closed doors. For Amara, the appointment meant more than title. It signaled that she would no longer be a footnote in someone else's charity. She would have a seat at the table that cut checks and wrote policies. Rebuilding was methodical. The foundation instituted transparent procurement processes. The ledgers were audited in public sessions where community members could read the entries and ask questions. Donors were given clear reports. The staff received training on reporting and a reformed grievance process. Social services, which had once been used as a threat, now partnered with the foundation to provide family supports, counseling, after-school care, subsidized dental clinics. Mrs.
Whitfield was reassigned to administrative leave and eventually asked to retire with a stipend that the board justified as a way to avoid protracted litigation. Some in the staff resented the soft landing. Others felt relief that the house's friction had calmed. Allen faced a different conclusion. Donors demanded his removal. Regulators opened inquiries, and he resigned amid a flurry of legal disclaimers and promises to cooperate. The foundation's restructuring continued like a long, careful surgery, stitches applied with steady hands. Amara's life stabilized in ways both small and profound. The nursery opened on a crisp morning in the transformed greenhouse, where once the staff had kept surplus flowers. Zara raced across the lawn with a group of children, everyone shouting and laughing like a small colony of birds. Amara watched from the margin with a mixture of disbelief and calibrated joy. Her name was on a plaque inside the nursery, not as an honorific, but as a notation of contribution, in partnership with the staff and community. Her relationship with Dominic grew in the measured way of two people who had been tested by grief and struggle and had chosen to respond with responsibility rather than possession. There were moments of warmth, shared cigarettes outside at 2 a.m. while the estate slept, a conversation about Isabella that did not end with apology, but with shared remembrance. There were moments of tenderness that were entirely their own, a hand offered to study a jarling, a foot brushing against a foot under a long table, a quiet conversation about future obligations. Amara accepted his help on the terms she said. He accepted her refusal to be a passive recipient. They spoke often of boundaries. Dominic made concrete gestures that were visible. Security reorganized to protect staff privacy. His public statements defended the integrity of the staff when accusations arose, and the foundation's bylaws were amended to ensure that no single director could unilaterally make procurement decisions without board oversight. These structural changes meant his support was not just private kindness, but public action. There was an intimacy that developed between them that was not dramatic theater, no sudden confessions in the rain or cinematic kisses. Instead, it happened in the small decimals of life, sharing the care of a sick child one winter night, collaborating on the nursery's kitchen menu, laughing at a silly mistake in a grant application late at night. When months after the scandal, they finally shared a kiss, it was after a board meeting where a previously underfunded program had been approved by unanimous vote. The kiss was careful, unmistakably consensual, and happened in a doorway with many witnesses. It was neither the beginning nor the end of anything dramatic. It was an honest moment between two people who had built a fragile trust on firm ground.
The staff's response to the reforms was mixed but gradually warmed.
Some, like Rosa, found new ways to use their experience to climb modestly. Rosa enrolled in a hospitality certificate the foundation subsidized and moved into a supervisory role. Natalie began managing vendor scheduling and found a voice in logistics that was solid and steady. Others took time to let their fears heal. Amara understood that not everyone equated reform with safety overnight. There were public consequences too. The county's inquiry into the attempted abduction produced charges against contractors tied to Allen's network. The police case used the van's registration and the GPS records as part of their chain of evidence. The men who had tried to take Zara faced charges for impersonation and conspiracy. The legal work was slow and had the cold rhythm of courts, but it delivered a kind of closure many had feared would never arrive. Amara's appointment to the advisory board was not a ceremonial victory. It came with responsibility: meetings, reading materials, long drives to neighborhood centers, and hours of listening. She learned the tedious language of grant applications, the ways a budget could be a map of values, and the importance of small print. When she proposed a pilot program to fund kitchen apprenticeships for local teens, Dominic listened and then used his voice to get the board to approve a modest seed grant. Months later, one of those teens, Aisha, sat across from Amara with a spattered apron and bright, ambitious eyes, the first cohort certificates in a neat stack. The transformation was not purely institutional. There were gifts, too, that belonged to the private life she had constructed. The apartment she rented grew more rooted: a donated set of plates from the foundation, a donated bookcase, a promise from a local landlord that rent would be eased for a year while Amara completed a small stipend program the foundation offered to staff who wanted to pursue education. These were small stitches in the life she had always dreamed of, but never expected to afford while raising a small child alone. And there were reminders, small, tender, and vivid, of where it had started. On the opening day of the nursery, Dominic handed Zara a small cupcake with a single candle. He did not press Amara to blow it out or to consume the attention. Instead, he stood back and watched as Zara made a tiny ceremonial wish, and Amara, standing near, caught the scent of buttercream and salt and the warmth of a light that had once been stolen. The candle's flame trembled and then steadied, and Amara felt the memory of that first stolen cupcake like a bookmark in the story of her life. When the Foundation's new procedures passed their first 6-month audit with positive marks, Amara walked the grounds with a quiet sense that a house could be reprogrammed, that systems could be so altered as to become instruments of dignity, rather than masks for predation.
She found the painting in the main hall one afternoon. Someone had restored it as part of a larger conservation project. The smear was gone, the varnish even, but underneath it, a small imperfection in the frame revealed the original wood like a scar. Amara ran her fingers along that edge and felt the same texture as the locket Dominic kept, a memory preserved but not erased. In the evenings, Zara would spread her drawings on the small kitchen table and declare them important, which they were. She learned quickly how to ask for things and how to make them herself when the asking was too slow. Amara taught her the small magic of making pastry and the steadiness of folding a napkin so its point touched east. At night, when the house fell into its padded hush, Amara would light a candle. No stolen acts now, but deliberate, small altars of ordinary joy. She would make a wish for the kind of things that feed a child's heart, that Zara would grow without the burden of fear, that light would reach others who had been kept in darkness, that the foundation would sustain its promise. There were times when pain returned in small, human ways. Mrs. Whitfield, when she finally spoke publicly about the stress of change, said things that suggested regret, but never fully acknowledged the harm done. Some in the staff found that resolution unsatisfying. Not all wounds had neat ends. Some simply closed with time and better policies. Amara learned to live with these half-closures, to build new rhythms around them. At the community celebration for the Foundation's new outreach programs, Amara stood beneath a line of lanterns that swung gently in the summer breeze. People listened as she spoke about small things, the dignity of being counted, the power of being seen by institutions that had more often looked the other way. She thought of the labor meetings she had attended years ago, of the leaflets and the nights of cold, and how those moments had taught her the tools she now used. At the close of the celebration, as the sun dipped low and made the lanterns into a string of steady stars, Dominic surprised her with a small box. It was not an offer or an ultimatum. It was a simple object, a silver locket, cleaned and polished, that held inside 2 tiny images, one of Isabella, the other of Zara, who had been drawn by Dominic's hand in a quiet moment. He placed the locket in her hands
and did not ask anything more than that she accepted. She did. "Keep it," he said, voice low, "so that when things get heavy, you'll remember both of them. The child who loved roof tiles, and the one who loves paper crowns." Amara touched the locket with fingers that had rinsed and scrubbed and arranged meals for other people's tables for more than a decade. The metal was cool, and then warmed by her skin. It carried the scent of lemon oil from his study.
She thought of how a single stolen candle had changed the axis of their lives, and how from that small light, many small fires had been built, some for comfort, some for warmth, some to burn down the rot. The house, once a place that taught her to vanish into its corners, had become a place that listened. It was a long and messy process, and pieces remained to be addressed, but there was a new protocol for complaints, a new seat at the advisory table for someone like her, and a nursery where Zara could run barefoot and glue her hair with daisies. Those changes were concrete, like ledgers balancing and signatures aligning. On a still morning not long after, Amara walked through the garden with Zara jogging at her side and a group of children trailing like a small, boisterous cloud. Sunlight sifted through the trees and made the dew on the grass look like a scatter of glass. The painting in the hall, the locket, the ledgers, each small object was a mark along the route she traveled. As they passed an old stone bench, Zara spotted a leftover cupcake from a community bake sale, a remnant, frosting crusted in a small, tidy mound. She picked it up with careful delight and asked, "Mama, can I have a wish?" Amara knelt beside her on the lawn and touched Zara's small fingers to the candle. It flickered, then burned steady. This time there was no theft, no furtive light. It was deliberate and communal. Amara closed her eyes for a moment and let herself make the kind of wish that had the weight of everything she'd learned, that the light they had lit here would be steady enough to light others, not to burn them. When she opened her eyes, she saw Dominic on the path watching them from a distance, hands in his pockets, a small, private smile folding his grief into something quieter. He had not come to stand in front or to claim the light. He had come to be beside it, present and steady. Amara reached for his hand and he met her halfway, not taking the lead, but offering his warmth. It was an unhurried contact, neither dramatic nor performative, two people who now understood each other's scars and chose to keep their hands gentle. They lingered on the bench as the children ran a small race and the lamplight of the nursery winked on. In the distance, the old portrait watched from the hall like a memory that had been partially repaired. The candle smoke from Zara's cupcake rose thin and then melted into the morning air, and in that trailing curl Amara saw, for a heartbeat, the shape of what had shifted, a tiny wish that had become a course of action, a personal ritual that had turned into public change. She let herself smile, finally, wide and unguarded. The house had not been remade in a perfect instant. It had been worked on, day by day, with paper and ledgers, and patient feet, and law and courage. She had not been rescued so much as she had rescued herself, with the help of others who chose to stand.
The candle that had once been small and secret now cast a warm glow that found the faces of many. Later that evening, after the children were in bed and the estate had folded into the hush of lamps and distant clocks, Amara held the locket to her chest. She thought of the way light could travel, from a stolen candle to a study lamp, to a courtroom, to the hands of people who would now have more power to be seen. She thought of the word dignity, and how it had once felt like a thing asked as a favor, and now felt more like a right that could be insisted upon. In the quiet, she blew out a small votive candle on her kitchen table, and, by the time she opened her eyes, Dominic was there in the doorway with 2 mugs of tea. He set one down beside her without overt ceremony. They drank in companionable silence, hands sometimes brushing, always intentional. "Do you remember the first time you told me about the picket line?" he asked. She smiled, tea steaming in the dim. "You asked if I liked chanting," she said. "You said it sounded loud and important." "It was," he said. "You're quieter now, but the important parts haven't gone. They're just placed better." She laughed softly and used the back of her hand to wipe a small spot of sugar from the mug's rim. Her hands were the same hands that had lit a stolen candle years before, and later slipped a flash drive into a return box. They were hands that could fold a napkin with a precise point and hold evidence. They were hands that could hold another's hand and not feel small. Outside, the house breathed.
Inside, the work continued, but with a slower, steadier rhythm. Amara had won no single sweeping victory. She had, instead, lived through the long mathematics of truth, file by file, witness by witness, vote by vote. She had refused the roles that House had tried to write for her, and in doing so, had helped to rewrite the house itself. On the mantel, the small cake box from the community celebration remained. It had been a ridiculous thing to keep to some, but she liked the paper grease stains on its lid, the memory they carried. She opened it and found one half-eaten cupcake, the frosting crusted with tiny sugar stars. She set it beside the cold camp candle and thought of the night it had started, the tiny flame between her hands and the eyes that had watched. Zara stirred in her sleep down the hall and murmured something about a paper crown. Amara kissed her forehead and then sat by the window with the locket and the cupcake and the candle. She lit the wick and watched the flame stand up as if taking position. For a long time, she simply watched it. When she finally spoke, it was not to the room or to the man in the doorway, but to herself, to a future she refused to leave to someone else's ledger. "Let it light more," we whispered. Outside, a new lamppost cast a steady halo over the path to the nursery. Inside, the flame she had once hidden now had a home in a simple glass votive.
It would not change everything, she knew, but it was a start. If this story moved you, subscribe for more narratives about hidden lives becoming visible, and consider supporting local organizations that lift up those whose work keeps our world running.